Iver Rausch was never the kind of man who drew attention. Quiet, methodical, with eyes that always seemed to be calculating something far beyond the room. But when investigators uncovered what he left behind at Black Hollow Farm, his name became synonymous with something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And Mira Kelton, the lead officer who first stepped into that nightmare, would come to learn that some discoveries don't just change a case, they change everything you believe about human nature. The air in Aderville was always heavy with mist, but on the morning of October 3rd, it carried something different, something sharp, foul, and unnatural. It drifted down from the northern edge of town, from a forgotten stretch of land called Black Hollow. Few people ever went that way. It was overgrown, quiet, and wrapped in local legend. The abandoned farm at its heart had been the property of Iver Rausch, a man who disappeared without a trace 5 years ago. No one had seen him since, and no one asked questions. But now, a complaint had been filed by a nearby hiker who caught the unmistakable scent of death in the air. The report landed on the desk of Officer Mira Kelton just before her shift ended. She considered passing it along to the next unit, but something about the address pulled her in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the silence that followed Iver's name in the database. No medical history, no social media, no known family after his disappearance. It was as if he had evaporated. She asked her partner, Jonas Creed, to ride with her. They made the drive just before sunset, headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that curled along the unpaved road. The farm stood like a monument to decay. Its roof sagged inward, and ivy had strangled much of the outer walls. A weather-beaten swing creaked in the breeze, hanging from a dead oak tree. The gate had long rusted shut, forcing them to climb over. The main house was unlocked. Inside, it was eerily preserved, plates still on the table, food rotted into black lumps, and a newspaper dated April 3, 2020, folded neatly on the couch. Dust lay over everything like a burial cloth, disturbed only by rat tracks and the occasional trail of dried mud. But it was the barn that screamed for attention, a chain wrapped around its double doors, thick and corroded. The stench was strongest, here, seeping from the cracks in the wood. Jonas cut the chain with bolt cutters, and both officers stepped back as the doors creaked open. The darkness inside was alive with flies. The beam from Mira's flashlight flicked across rusted tools, broken crates, and then, in the far corner, a row of barrels, dozens of them, all sealed tight with metal lids, each tagged with a faded strip of masking tape. They stepped closer, nausea rising with every breath. One barrel near the center had a jagged crack. From it leaked a thick, blackish fluid that pooled at its base. The smell turned unbearable. Mira held her sleeve over her face and leaned in. A portion of the lid had buckled, revealing something, pale beneath the slime. Jonas lifted the flashlight higher. A hand floated just beneath the surface, decomposed but unmistakable. Human. They backed away in silence, stunned into stillness. The realization sank in slowly. This wasn't a single act of violence. This was a burial ground, a storage site. Someone had sealed human remains in barrels and left them here, preserved in the quiet of Black Hollow. And if one barrel held a body, it was likely the others did too. Mira radioed for backup. The words caught in her throat, trembling as she forced them out. Forensics, homicide, the coroner, she called everyone. Within the hour, the place would be flooded with crime scene tape, floodlights, and the low hum of investigators whispering theories. But for now, Mira and Jonas stood alone in the heart of something unspeakable. The abandoned farm had given up its secret, and it was just the beginning. By the following morning, the once-forgotten farm at Black Hollow was crawling with investigators, forensic teams, and media vans parked just beyond the property line. Word had spread fast. The discovery of human remains in barrels, over a dozen. Suspected victims, shocked the quiet town of Aderville to its core. Yellow tape fluttered like ribbons in the wind as officers secured every inch of the property. For many, This was the largest crime scene they'd ever encountered. For Officer Mira Kelton, it already felt personal. As forensic teams began cataloging the barrels, Mira turned her attention back to the house. Something about it didn't sit right. The way it had been preserved, the lack of dust in certain corners, the locked windows. It didn't feel abandoned. She moved through the rooms again, more carefully this time, running her hand along the edges of furniture, tapping on floorboards, checking behind cabinets. In the bedroom closet, she noticed something odd. A small gap at the back panel, just wide enough to slide her fingers into. She tugged, and the panel creaked open, revealing a narrow crawl space. Inside, there was a wooden box and a leather-bound book sitting neatly on top of it. The book was brittle, but the cover bore a single word written in heavy ink: Ledger. Mira opened it slowly. Each page was lined with names. Next to each name was a date, and beside that, a strange symbol, some that looked like runes, others like simplified sketches of stars or circles. The first few names were unfamiliar, but halfway through, Mira froze. The name Sarandel stared back at her. She remembered it from a cold case filed in 2018, a nurse who had vanished during a night shift at Northridge Hospital. The case had gone cold within months, no clues, no suspects. And now, her name was here, in a hidden book on the farm of a man who disappeared the same year. Mira carefully closed the ledger and placed it into an evidence bag. Her heart was racing. This wasn't just a list, it was a record, a collection, and someone had been keeping it meticulously. Outside, the forensic team had begun opening the barrels one by one. Human bones, hair, teeth, each one revealed the same gruesome truth. The bodies were not dumped. They had been processed, cleaned in some way, and preserved in a thick chemical solution. Whoever did this had knowledge of anatomy and decomposition. This wasn't the work of someone who panicked. It was methodical. Further examination of the barn uncovered a locked cabinet tucked behind hay bales. Inside were photos, old, curled, at the edges, some printed from cheap printers, others developed on glossy paper. Each photo depicted a person. Some were smiling, standing beside cars or on picnic benches. Others looked like mugshots. A few were visibly afraid, caught in dimly, lit rooms, eyes wide. These weren't just strangers. They were the faces of the missing. Dozens of them. Detectives from surrounding counties were called in to compare the photos to open missing persons cases. Matches were found quickly. A woman from Clearwater, gone since 2019. A young boy from Edgewater, last seen on a camping trip. A college student from Harrow Bay. Their names began lining up with the ones in the ledger. Everything was connected. But then something even more unsettling surfaced. Mira's partner, Jonas Creed, noticed a pattern in the symbols. They weren't random at all. Each one corresponded to a time of year, possibly seasonal or ritualistic. He began mapping the dates, and a disturbing rhythm emerged. Whoever was behind this had been killing according to a schedule, carefully, deliberately, every few months for years. Mira returned to the ledger and flipped to the last page. There were still more names, still more victims unaccounted for. But the final entries had no dates beside them. They were blank, waiting to be filled. The investigation shifted focus as more entries in the ledger were matched to cold cases. Each victim had vanished within a radius of 100 miles around Aderville. Most had disappeared without any known connections to each other. Different towns, different backgrounds, different lives. But there was one common thread that tied several of them together. A link to Iver Rausch. Detectives began digging into Iver's history, pulling records from psychiatric facilities, old medical files, and school documents that had been buried in dusty archives. What they found painted a picture more disturbing than anyone expected. Iver had been institutionalized on 3 separate occasions before the age of 30. The earliest admittance occurred after a violent episode at age 17, when he was found in a forest near his family's property, covered in blood. The source of the blood was never confirmed. One file in particular stood out. It was dated just 6 months before Iver's disappearance and was authored by a psychiatrist named Dr. Aloan Thatch. She had been treating Iver at a private facility outside of town, an expensive place known for handling high-risk patients with discretion. Her notes were unsettling. She described Iver as highly intelligent, dangerously manipulative, and obsessed with something she referred to as purification cycles. He believed that certain individuals were tainted and that their removal from the world served a greater balance. Her report included sketches he had drawn, complex patterns resembling those found in the ledger. She'd written that he talked frequently about preserving what was left of purity in the world, and that he feared contamination from others. Dr. Thatch disappeared in late 2016. She had been reported missing by her colleagues after failing to show up for a weekend conference. Her car was found abandoned by a lake, her belongings still inside. Her case had remained unsolved, and now her name appeared in the ledger. The deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became that Iver had not acted alone in the early years. Witness. Accounts from staff at the psychiatric facility hinted at unusual behavior during Iver's stay. One nurse recalled Iver receiving unauthorized visitors, though no names had been logged. Another mentioned that medical equipment frequently went missing, nothing major enough to raise alarms, but odd patterns: surgical gloves, IV fluids, anesthetic vials. No one had pieced it together at the time. The evidence from the farm supported this timeline. Forensic specialists recovered surgical tools from the basement, each meticulously cleaned and stored in labeled drawers. There were scalpels, bone saws, clamps, and even dental equipment. Everything was organized with precision, suggesting not only medical knowledge, but experience. This wasn't improvised violence. It was controlled. Pinned to one of the basement walls were dozens of photos of human anatomy, printed pages from old textbooks with handwritten notes scribbled in the margins. There were also diagrams of internal organs, pressure points, and lists of chemical compounds used in embalming. It was as if someone had been learning, practicing. Mira grew more disturbed with each finding. She requested access to the North Ridge Hospital's employee records, where Saren Dell, the nurse from the ledger, had worked before her disappearance. Cross-checking schedules revealed that Saren had been assigned to Iver's care just 2 weeks before she vanished. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Iver had used his time in treatment to identify skilled individuals, nurses, doctors, therapists, and then made them part of his twisted rituals. Some were likely victims. Others, possibly, were forced to assist him under threat. The true extent of his operation was still unknown. But one thing was certain: Iver Rausch hadn't simply gone mad. He had planned every step, learned every skill, and built something horrific, hidden in plain sight, piece by piece. The orchard behind the barn had always looked lifeless, with crooked trees and patchy grass that never seemed to grow properly. Locals had avoided it for years, claiming the land felt wrong, like it was holding something beneath its roots. Now, with the farm officially declared a crime scene, that orchard became the focus of a new phase in the investigation. A ground-penetrating radar team arrived at dawn. Within 2 hours, they found the first disturbance: an area of soil that had been dug and refilled multiple times. Then another, and another. In total, 14 distinct burial sites were marked, with red flags. Each one appeared shallow and oddly spaced, almost symmetrical. At first glance, it seemed the graves had been placed in a grid. But when mapped out, their arrangement formed a strange shape, almost circular, with a slight spiral inward, as though the graves had been positioned according to some hidden pattern. Mira stood silently as excavation began. The first site revealed fragments of cloth, bone, and what remained of a necklace tangled in the soil. Forensics worked slowly, carefully, treating the scene with the gravity of a mass grave. One by one, remains were uncovered, some nearly skeletal, others partially mummified due to the chemical conditions of the ground. But there was something else in each grave. A stone, smooth and flat, placed either in the mouth or on the chest of every body. The stones bore carvings, faint but deliberate, the same symbols from the ledger. Each stone was different, as though representing something unique to each victim. Some had simple shapes, others intricate lines forming symbols that no one could immediately identify. An expert in symbology was called in to assist, and after a day of study, she gave her chilling assessment. The markings resembled those used by obscure purification cults, some dating back centuries, where cleansing was done through sacrifice. This confirmed what Mira had begun to fear. Iver wasn't just killing. He believed he was performing rituals, part of a larger ideology that only he fully understood. His obsession with purity, documented in his psychiatric records, had manifested into something tangible. The graves, the symbols, the timing. They were all part of a system. But even more disturbing was what wasn't found. There were more names in the ledger than graves in the orchard, more victims than accounted for. And the forensic team discovered signs that chemicals had been poured into certain grave sites, possibly to dissolve remains more rapidly. Iver had not only killed, he had tried to erase evidence in a precise clinical way. His background in anatomy and access to medical knowledge had made that possible. While documenting the area, one of the techs stumbled upon a buried object between two trees, a sealed metal box, weathered but intact. Inside was a collection of items, torn pieces of ID cards, jewelry, small personal effects like hair clips and watches. It was a trophy box, kept hidden, each item labeled with a number corresponding to entries in the ledger. Among them was a locket containing a photo of a woman and child. The woman was later identified as Dr. Aloan Thatch. It became clear that Iver hadn't chosen his victims randomly. Most were professionals, nurses, doctors, social workers, therapists, individuals he had encountered during his psychiatric treatments, but others seemed unconnected, like the child in the photo. This suggested the possibility that some victims weren't targets, but witnesses, or perhaps people who had simply gotten too close. The realization brought a dark weight to the investigation. Iver's motives weren't just ritualistic, they were evolving. His methods were changing, becoming more efficient, more cruel, more calculated. And now it appeared he had been experimenting with ways to vanish without a trace. Evidence suggested the use of acid pits, homemade cremation tools, and chemical solvents. The farm had been a place of death, but the orchard had been something worse, a testing ground, a place where Iver refined his process, perfected it. And if the symbols and spacing of the graves meant anything, it wasn't finished. The pattern was incomplete. There were spaces left unfilled, spaces that suggested he had planned to return. As the investigation deepened, the horror at Black Hollow took on an even more disturbing tone. For weeks, the discovery of remains, documents, and hidden chambers kept law enforcement rooted at the site, and yet a question lingered in every mind. Where was Iver Rausch? No trace of him had ever been found. His disappearance in 2020 had sparked only minor local concern at the time, but now it was clear he hadn't vanished. He had simply slipped into the shadows of his own design. What confounded investigators further was the absence of any digital footprint. Iver had left no emails, no bank activity, no online presence. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself. Even the surveillance cameras around town failed to capture him in the weeks before his disappearance, as though he knew exactly where to walk, how to move, how to stay invisible. Then came the breakthrough. A forensic analyst reviewing soil samples from beneath the barn uncovered a trap door, expertly camouflaged. Beneath it was a tunnel, narrow, winding, and lined with concrete slabs. It stretched nearly 100 feet underground, ending in a steel door. Behind that door, they found a bunker. It was stark and windowless, a room built for survival. Inside were shelves stocked with supplies, canned food, bottled water, surgical tools, stacks of notebooks, and a power generator humming in the corner. It was a sanctuary built by someone who had no intention of leaving. On one wall was a large board covered with photographs, strings, and symbols, the same ones found on the grave markers. It was a timeline, one that spanned over a decade. At the center of the board was a symbol not previously found on the property. It resembled a spiral, drawn in thick black marker, with an eye at its center. Beneath it, written in jagged handwriting, were the words, "The last phase is the return." Mira Kelton stared at the board in silence. The implication was clear. Iver hadn't just planned the killings. He had seen them as steps, each one part of a grand conclusion that he believed was yet to come. The chilling phrase suggested he intended to come back to the farm, to finish something. The pattern of grave placements, the empty spaces in the ledger, and now this message. It was all pointing to one truth. Iver was still alive. The search widened beyond Aderville. Airports, hospitals, homeless shelters, even remote cabins across the state were checked. Facial recognition technology was deployed, but there were no hits. Still, the investigators refused to believe he had gone far. Someone with his level of obsession wouldn't abandon his work. He would watch. He would wait. And then he struck again. 3 weeks after the bunker's discovery, a woman named Letha Moore vanished from a nearby town. She had been a coroner working with the investigation, specifically assigned to the identification of remains. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the task force. Her apartment was undisturbed. Her car was found parked behind a grocery store. But her ID card and phone were missing. Days later, a package arrived at the Aderville Police Department. It contained a single item, one of the carved stones, identical to those found in the orchard graves. Carved into its surface was a new symbol. One not listed in the ledger, one no one recognized. Panic set in. The message was clear. Iver was watching the investigation. He knew their moves, and now he was back in control. Mira reviewed the bunker once more, focusing on the timelines and patterns. Something gnawed at her, the idea that this had never been just about death. It was about transformation. Iver believed he was cleansing the world, but more than that, he saw himself as a guide to some new order. And his message, the return, was not a threat to come back to the farm. It was a promise to bring the horrors of Black Hollow into the world outside. The case remained open. The ledger remained incomplete. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces, one thinks to look. Iver Rausch was waiting to complete his design.